Welcome to ERDC Live. I am your host, Shelley Tingle with the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center Corporate Communications Office. Today, we are continuing our conversation about climate change with our very own Dr. Joe Corriveau. Dr. Corriveau is the director of the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory in Hanover, New Hampshire. Welcome, Dr. Corriveau.
Hey, greetings from Hanover, New Hampshire. It's a pleasure to be talking with you today and looking forward to talking about climate change.
So in ERDC's first LinkedIn Live with ERDC Director Dr. David Pittman, he called climate change and its impact a threat to the security of our nation and the world. How is CREL leveraging its core competencies, people, and facilities to research the ongoing effects of climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think the best way to answer that question is go back in history because actually the roots of our laboratory, the Cold Regions Lab, go back to the 1940s in Alaska, where the Corps of Engineers was tasked with building the Alaska-Canadian Highway. And this highway is something like 1,500 miles long, and they built it in a matter of months. But one of the greatest challenges was building the highway on what we call permafrost. And so permafrost is frozen earth. And did you know, for example, that as an aside, for the northern hemisphere, 25% of the landmass is permafrost. In Russia, 65% of Russia is permafrost. In Alaska, 85% of Alaska is permafrost. So this is frozen ground. And the Corps of Engineers had a hard time building on it. And so the roots of our core competencies go all the way back to the 1940s with the building of this highway in Alaska. And so we have a number of core competencies today to include an understanding of permafrost and how to build infrastructure and sustain infrastructure on permafrost. And so to this day, part of our infrastructure and part of our core competency resides in Alaska. So ERDC, or CREL, actually has a laboratory up in Fairbanks, and actually we run and manage our nation's permafrost research tunnel. And this is a tunnel complex with almost 500 meters of tunnel down into the permafrost of the landmass of Alaska. So we have core competencies, we have facilities, we have a deep experience in various aspects of a changing climate to change that one area of permafrost. But we have others. We have expertise within this particular lab with snow, ice, sea ice, et cetera, and an understanding of these aspects of our environment and how they're affected by a changing climate. But that's one good example I thought you'd appreciate, that our roots go way back to the 1940s with that one particular core competency. Because why? Because with the changing climate, the permafrost is thawing out. And there's a lot of very important infrastructure built upon permafrost today, which is a tremendous risk because of the warming climate.
I think that a lot of people really don't know why ERDC or why CREL. And the reason is because you guys have been doing this for a very long time. And
Yes.
So one of your new facilities is the new $3.9 million climatic chamber facility, which is currently under construction to test vehicles and concrete structures at extremely low temperatures. How important is this testing to military and civil works operations?
Yeah, hey, good question. So here on our installation up in New Hampshire, we have some unique facilities. And so as we speak today, we have facilities that are operational, running experiments way below the freezing point, some down as low as minus 40 degrees. And it's important to have these capabilities because being part of the Corps of Engineers, being part of the Army, we need to run experiments and test equipment down to very low temperatures to make sure that they're going to work out in the real environment. And so what's really wonderful about the new climate chamber is, number one, it's going to go down to minus 54 degrees Celsius. So we're going even further down in our temperature range for working working on problems for the military and for civil works. And we can also control the humidity in there. So this is a true climate chamber where we can go to these extremely cold temperatures. And so, for example, we'll be able to drive developmental military platforms in there to be able to test them and their various components down to those extreme cold temperatures. Or, for example, when it comes to civil works, for example, we do a lot of research in cold concrete. In other words, trying to develop new technologies so that you can work with concrete in colder and colder temperatures. So this new facility is going to be a great new asset for the laboratory and for supporting our mission space, which deals with scientific and engineering challenges in extremely cold environments.
That is so exciting. And that's part of how CREL is unique. And so we know that you're also very unique, your organization is, as the only federal laboratory with cold regions mission tasked with all things snow, ice, and permafrost. Could you speak about research projects at CREL that specifically address how we can adapt to the negative effects of climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I want to here's how I want to answer it. I want to answer it about how research at CREL has helped us to understand climate change, so that we can understand what the challenges are. Let me start with another history lesson. Back in the 1960s, CREL was up in Greenland, and we had a task to remove an ice core from one of the glaciers in Greenland. And so what we were able to do is we developed the technology so we could take an ice core off this glacier. So this ice core was almost a mile long, okay? And so they removed this ice core, they brought it back here to CREL in Hanover, New Hampshire, and then working with partners both nationally and at the international level, some really interesting scientific activities were initiated to take advantage of these ice cores. Because what we realized is, as you go down through the glacier, you're going back through time. And so there's these like annual rings in the ice core, just like if you think about a tree having annual rings, and you can count the rings, so you know how old the tree is, and you can determine how much rainfall there was for every year. It's the same thing with ice cores. And working with other scientists, we were able to go down through those ice cores and be able to determine what was the temperature of the atmosphere, thousands of years ago. What were the greenhouse gas levels thousands of years ago? And so doing this work with ice cores from Greenland, and also we went down to Antarctica to remove more ice cores. But a lot of very foundational information came out of these ice cores that help us to understand climate change today. In short, we were able to determine that our climate does change over long cycles, and that when temperatures go up over thousands of years, that's when the greenhouse gases go up, and when it cools off, the greenhouse gas levels go down. And so we were able to work with others to come to understand that our planet does go through these cycles. Now, what's interesting is we're not doing ice core drilling anymore at CREL, but we're still in Greenland. So, for example, today we have this LiDAR technology running at this very second, collecting billions of bits of information every day. And what we're doing is we're monitoring the movement and if you will, the health of glacial ice sheets in Greenland. And in short, what we're doing today is we're basically watching the ice sheets melt. So our roots here at CREL go back to Greenland, where we started to do foundational research to understand climate change. And we're still up there kind of monitoring continued changes in this case, the glacial ice sheets in Greenland as a result of climate change. So we here at Corriveau, if you will, part of ERDC, we have done a lot of foundational research and continue to understand that our planet is changing as a result of the environment becoming warmer.
And Dr. Corriveau, as you know, we recently did a podcast about your research that your lab is conducting with ice adhesion. And so I will invite our listeners, if you want to know more about some of this research going on in the area of ice adhesion, you can go to powerofardicpodcast.org and listen to more about that. And so you addressed some of the differences between climate change and global warming. So many people connect climate change to global warming, but climate change research also focuses on changing weather patterns, severe weather, and extreme temperatures, both warm and cold. What other climate change misconceptions do you hope are put aside through the research being conducted by ERDC and Corriveau?
You know, I'm glad you asked that question because there's clearly a lot of misconceptions about the topic of climate change. There's also a bit of controversy over to what level is human activity responsible for climate change. What I will say is it's wonderful to be part of an organization that has been conducting research literally for decades on this topic. It's also wonderful to be part of an organization where one of our 5 strategic goals is to promote understanding. And so I think part of our role as the ERDC is to promote understanding so that people have, for example, policymakers can make informed policy decisions based on science, et cetera, et cetera. In the case of climate change, I'll say this. In the 1970s, I was in the public school system learning about our world, our environment, and even back in the 1970s, and I am dating myself, we were learning about how there's this phenomenon called the greenhouse effect, and what it was is that greenhouse gases were floating up to our upper atmosphere and was trapping heat. And it's a well-accepted phenomenon. And so to build upon this connection between climate change and a warming planet, I offer the following. Back in the 1970s, when I was in school, the carbon dioxide level in our atmosphere was around maybe 330 parts per million. Today, we're over 400 parts per million. So clearly the carbon dioxide, methane gas, these greenhouse gases are increasing, and they're up there in the atmosphere. And as the heat rises from our planet, it does get held in place. But then there's these other things that are happening. For example, we hear about the sea ice in the Arctic melting. So consider the following. When light energy comes down and it strikes sea ice, and snow, which is white, most of that energy gets reflected back into space. It's called the albedo. So let's say 90% of that energy gets reflected off ice and snow. When the sea ice melts, you now have blue ocean. When that light energy strikes the ocean, 90% of the energy is absorbed by the ocean. And anyone tracking climate change is tracking what's happening to the sea ice in the Arctic. It's melting. And so now we have another piece of the puzzle here where the ocean is capturing more of that heat energy. There's heat being generated in the ocean. And then that continues to lead to, for example, ultimately to weather patterns and how they're influenced by the temperatures of the oceans. And then you can follow that trail, and I'm leaving some parts out here. But what happens, you start having changes in weather patterns. You start having where the ocean temperature is higher than normal. So in those parts of the ocean where hurricanes are starting to develop, you have more energy, which leads to more extreme weather events. And then what starts to happen is you start to have extreme weather events, so you have flooding. But on the other hand, other parts of the planet have drought. And so it's all interrelated, and it goes back to the warming of our planet, which leads to all of these other events taking place. And then it comes down to what I think becomes the controversial point, which is it a result of human activity? And so what scientists have done is they're like accountants. They're trying to take account for where all the greenhouse gases are coming from. And when they do all the math, it looks like it's coming from us. And so the important thing is that we realize that our climate is changing, and this is very important to us on many different levels. I will cite, for example, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Austin, a couple months ago, he said that climate change is making the world more unsafe, and we need to act. And what he means by that is, as the sea levels rise, as communities or societies are challenged with their sources of food, their sources of water, and again, being displaced by drought or by sea level rise or flooding, that's going to put stress on societies, which can lead to challenges for national security. So we, as part of the Army and the Department of Defense, we have to think about that, what some of these effects are of climate change, because it's more than sea level rise, it's more than flooding, it's more than extreme weather events. It also has to do with our national security, because if you think about it, some societies on this planet are down at sea level, and they're challenged right now. And some societies are already struggling with their food supply and their water supply. And so that's a challenge. So I agree with Dr. Pittman and his thoughts on this, and certainly also with the Secretary of Defense, that this is something we have to pay attention to, and we need to go to work to try to come up with solutions so that we can maintain our national security, and also do two things. One, try to mitigate climate change, which means reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but also to adapt, which is something that ERDC's doing a lot of this very day. You know, how do we adapt to this changing climate?
And so when you talk about these stressors that we're under, that falls in alignment to ERDC's mission. So ERDC's overarching mission is to discover, develop, deliver new ways to make the world safer and better every day. Given the comments by ERDC leadership and the administration that you just talked about on the threat climate change poses to our society, what are some of the deliverables you see coming from ERDC's focus on climate change and its effects?
Sure, I got a few right off the top of my head. One is Crowell's already doing it. We're already providing solutions to how to build resilience into infrastructure built on permafrost that's thawing out. In fact, we had a team that just got back from Thule Air Force Base up in Greenland. Thule Air Force Base is built on permafrost. Same thing for all of our military forces in Alaska. Virtually everything's on permafrost. So today we're delivering solutions already. Our environmental lab has been working with engineering with nature, which is an amazing way to work with nature itself to try to offset the vulnerabilities to rise in sea level or to flood in inland waterways. And finally, one that I'm especially excited about is down at our GSL laboratory. They're looking at ways to come up with construction materials that reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Did you know that about 80% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the concrete industry? And so if you can come up with a new way a new formulation for concrete that doesn't create so many greenhouse gases, you're actually helping to mitigate the problem. And so these are just a few examples of what the Engineering Research and Development Center is doing to counter some of the challenges posed to us by climate change.
I love it. I love hearing about all the solutions that our engineers and scientists are coming up with to help solve some of these stressors that we're dealing with in association to climate change. So for those listeners who have just recently joined us, I am Shelley Tingle, host of the show, and we have with us Dr. Joe Corriveau from our Corriveau laboratory in Hanover. So at this time, we're going to take questions from our LinkedIn audience. And so we have a question from Rick Kaiser. Hello, sir. What other ERDC labs are involved? Environmental, coastal, lots of room for collaboration with industry.
Well, you came to the right place. So Dr. Pittman named me as the climate change champion for ERDC, and so I formed a Tiger team. And one of the first goals of our Tiger team was to pull together and integrate our collective core competencies. And so all 7 of the ERDC labs have come together as to like bring all this power, the power of ERDC, bring it all together. And so we are prepared to work together as one large enterprise to tackle climate change problems. So we've already come together. All 7 laboratories are involved in that initiative. And we're ready to pounce on challenges as they arise. Again, we formed the Tiger team just a couple months ago, and we're ready to go to work.
Mark has a question. Do you foresee a change in Corriveau's mission as previously extreme cold weather regions slowly warm?
Oh, absolutely not. Wow, I could talk about this one for a long time. Number one, climate change is it's a huge problem, and so this is one of the reasons all 7 of the ERDC labs came together, because our core competency really is in extreme cold regions of the planet. That's only a little piece of the climate change challenge. So I don't see our mission changing much. We're just part of the overall team to approach climate change on behalf of all of ERDC. Our mission is going to remain perhaps increasingly more important in the extreme cold regions of the planet. For example, the Army just published the Army's Arctic strategy. And so the name of the Army Arctic strategy is Regaining Arctic Dominance, which implies we're not the dominant force in the Arctic, and rightly so. We have fallen behind Russia when it comes to the Arctic. And so there's an intent by Department of Defense, by the Army, by the Navy, by the Air Force to enhance our capabilities in the Arctic. And which means we have to remain focused on the Arctic. There's also, and this is a little science fiction like talking, some of the core competence we have we're actually directing towards organizations like NASA. In the past, believe it or not, the Corps of Engineers and ERDC has supported NASA in its mission space. And so we're working with NASA, and we've also started talking to Space Force. And when you think about the future of NASA with its planned mission to the moon and to Mars, those are extremely cold environments. So we're already supporting them in the development of technologies so that eventually we can put human habitats, for example, on Mars. And so I think it's very important that we maintain our core competencies for extremely cold regions of the planet or other planets. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Okay, one of our audience members, Christy, wants to know the following. We also hear about the hole in the ozone. I wonder how that plays into climate change.
Yeah, you don't hear more, you know, this is an interesting question. I remember when I was younger, we were worried about the hole in the ozone layer and how there were refrigerants, these fluoride compounds, these refrigerants that were damaging the ozone layer. And something remarkable happened. People came together, they passed new policies, and they put new technologies in place. And we started to solve the problem because we stopped using the chemicals that were damaging the ozone layer. So we did that. And this is kind of like a repeat of what happened historically, except this time it's a bit of a bigger challenge perhaps. But yeah, I remember about the hole in the ozone and that issue was addressed at the global level. Globally, a solution was found, and we've kind of moved on from that. And so it's related, but a slightly different challenge. But yeah, that's an interesting thought about climate change and the hole in the ozone. Yeah, we moved on from that, thank goodness.
So Jay has the following question. What do you say to those who believe that what has already been done to the environment can't be undone?
Well, that it's almost a philosophical question. It, I believe that humans can figure it out. We're going to figure this out. It appears to me clear that our leaders, our societies did the best that they thought they were doing the right thing to have healthy societies, freedoms and liberty and all the goodness of life. And we came to a point where we realized that maybe we're going to have to change some of our behaviors as we go into the future. So the way I look at it, and I was thinking about this just the other day, it's like, wait a minute. We used to use horses to move things around and then trains, and now we have automobiles, the internal combustion engine. And I thought, electric vehicles, it's coming. I'm convinced that we're going back, that's part of the future is going to be electric vehicles. And it'll have to take a change in our behaviors. I also believe that we're going to be looking at some forms of energy that don't depend on fossil fuels. And so I think what's going to happen is that, okay, got it, we did some damage, but we can move forward by changing our behaviors and changing because I know we all value the environment and we all value, a healthy people, healthy environment. So I think it's just a matter of us developing the technologies and figuring how to get them out there. And that we will have a way ahead in which we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And then that starts to address the problem of global warming. And then it's going to take a while, but if we can do that, we're going to be okay. But in fact, if you look at the executive order for the climate crisis, or if you look at what the Department of Defense is trying to do, they're really trying to focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's like a major focal point. And for this very reason, but the thing is, y'all got to agree to want to do that. Y'all got to think that's a good idea, and it's got to be economically viable. For example, I'm not trying to sell Ford, okay? But they just came out with the Ford F-150 Lightning. And I thought, brilliant, because they're selling an image of an F-150 that's better than the combustion engine version of it. And I was thinking that's going to catch on. And I think that's the kind of thing that could get people to kind of shift their mindset to, yeah, I'm going to try one of these electric vehicles. By the way, where do I charge it up? Right? You're going to have charging stations. And so I think that maybe part of the solution, I'm not involved in the infrastructure planning by the government. But in my mind, part of the solution has to be, if you're going to go towards electric vehicles, you have to have charging stations like everywhere. And so I think that's the direction we're going in. Forms of energy that don't depend on the fossil fuels, and that includes electric vehicles. I'm not sure what they're going to do about aircraft yet. That's tough. I don't know how they do that, but I'm sure someone's working on it.
Yeah, I'm sure that we're going to come up with a solution for that one as well. And so one of our viewers asked, because you mentioned your permafrost tunnel in Alaska, he says, can you expand on that? What are some things you have learned from studying the permafrost in the Arctic?
Right. Wow. We're still studying it. For example, one of the things we've learned is that before you even build on it, the technologies has been developed for using things like ground penetrating radar and that. You don't want to build on permafrost where there's these giant wedges of frozen water, right? Because permafrost is very diverse. There could be a lot of chunks of frozen ice, or maybe it's mostly soil. So for one thing we learned is you can actually go out and do assessments of where you plan to build, and you can actually try to find the better spots. We've also been involved, as an aside, in the development of technologies to remove heat out of the ground. And it sounds counterproductive, but there's technology in place in which you take heat out of the ground and release it into the atmosphere to try to keep permafrost frozen. So we've worked on technologies like that. We also, and this is sounds a little strange, we're working on microorganisms in permafrost to include some microorganisms that have been frozen perhaps for thousands of years. And so one of the other areas we're studying is the microbiology of permafrost. Let me give you an example of why this is important. Probably about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a boy in a Russian village. I think he was about 12 years old, and he died from anthrax. And what had happened, there was the carcass of a caribou that had been frozen in permafrost, and I guess there was thawing and melting, and members of a village got in contact with this caribou. Some became sick, and one person actually died from anthrax. So there's a concern that with the thawing permafrost, one of the things we might have to be wary of is could there be something pathogenic that's been frozen in time that could be released? And so we at CREL have sent representatives to an international conference for the pandemic, but we sent them to an international conference sponsored by the National Academy of Science. So people in the health field are concerned about even what could come out of the thawing permafrost. So that's another area that we're studying, leveraging the fact that we're down inside the permafrost tunnel. And in fact, many of the samples we take out of there are associated with pulling these microorganisms out of their state of being frozen in time, if you will. As an aside, it's amazing walking down in the permafrost tunnel because I'll never forget the first time I walked down and there was grass, green grass hanging from the ceiling. And I looked up and I said, why is there grass here? And I was told, it's been there about 30,000 years. It's like, it's green. Somebody's got to mow it. It's like, it's amazing how things get frozen in time, literally for thousands of years. So, by the way, our permafrost tunnel is a very, absolutely amazing, one-of-a-kind type of facility or not, it's not a facility, but a, a tunnel to visit. And so we always like having visitors who come to see us up in Alaska, and we like to take them to the tunnel because it's amazing to see what the Earth, we go back over 30,000 years in time. It's amazing to see what's down there. And of course, you have the mammoth tusks and the stuff like that all frozen in time too. So we love to have visitors up in Fairbanks.
Well, I'm going to take that as a personal invitation. And so I would
Should.
love to go see the permafrost tunnel. So we have another question from a viewer. How has ERDC been working with partner nations and vulnerable nations on climate change to minimize influence by our competitors? Specifically, what types of solutions have we shared?
You might have me on that one. That's a good question. You might have me on that one. I do know that. Can you help me?
Let me ask this question. So you talked a little bit about partnerships. So
Right.
can you elaborate on some of these partnerships and what that collaboration and that type of research, what is the value in that, and what are some examples of collaboration in your lab?
Yeah, again, that's a great question. So we do collaborate with others. I know we've collaborated down in Chile and India on mountain warfare issues, because when you're way up thousands of feet in mountains, there's ice and snow, and so we do collaborate with other countries. When it comes to the Arctic, we currently are collaborating with some of our other Arctic nations on topics such as mobility, which is a very big topic. There's also, we indirectly, through some of our other Army laboratories, work with partner nations on how to keep people safe in the Arctic. One of a major challenge for the Army is frostbite. And every year the Army has a relatively large number of people who suffer from frostbite, and most of those people are not in the Arctic. It's either they're somewhere in the middle of winter or they're in the subarctic. So there are ways we're working with other nations. Although right now I'm having trouble thinking about how we've helped them on the topic of climate change. And so I'm challenged on that one. I'm challenged to go find a partner. And I'm going to have to leave it at that, because right now I'm not thinking. We're working with another country on the topic of climate change.
So we have a very engaged audience today. What can we do to separate science from politics? What and when do you plan on publishing your findings, or do you envision providing recommendations about climate change?
Yeah, wow, I don't even know where to begin. There's a lot of documents already published on climate change by even by the Corps of Engineers, and I'm trying to look for an example here. I'll start with this one. The Climate Change Adaptation Plan, United States Army Corps of Engineers, June 2015. There's a whole series of documents that have been published by the Corps of Engineers on how we need to be mindful of climate change and how to respond to it. I've got the Atlas of Observed Sea Level Change, Corps of Engineers. So there's a lot of published documents out there about this phenomenon of, rise in sea level, extreme weather events, how to adapt to a changing climate. They're out there on the internet. I was amazed at what I found out there when I took my role here as the director 4 years ago, and I started reading more about this mission space. There's actually a lot of documentation out there already when it comes to, for example, the threat of climate change. I have the worldwide threat assessment from our national, the U.S. intelligence community. This is on the internet. It was published 2 years ago. So our government realizes that climate change is a threat. The Corps of Engineers recognizes that and has integrated it into how it approaches, when it's performing its mission along our coastlines or our inland waterways. It takes all this into consideration. Of course, it's the Corps of Engineers whose mission is to take care of our inland waterways. So there's a lot of published documents out there, and I think what we're witnessing today is a very powerful policy that came out of the White House. I have that right here, the executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And what you're seeing is government agencies responding to the executive order. And what will follow from the executive order is government agencies will develop policies, and then those policies will be implemented through resourcing. So we're at the very beginning of this pivot, if you will, towards a topic which has been given a higher level of just a higher priority in terms of importance in this case, by the White House. And so we here at CREL, ERDC, we have been supporting the Army in the development of the Army Climate Action Plan. We've been supporting the Corps of Engineers in the development of the Corps of Engineers Climate Action Plan. And so we see this movement because of the executive order. But with all that said, there's all these documentations about climate change and the science of it. And it's been there. It's just, in this case, it's been given a higher priority, but it's always been there in the background.
Right, because you've been doing this for a long time, as you stated in the beginning.
We've been doing this. We're doing this.
Decades of research.
So for example, the DoD climate assessment tool was developed by the Corps of Engineers, and some of the scientists here helped to work on that. So the DoD climate assessment tool was developed by the Corps of Engineers, and it's currently being used to assess the vulnerabilities of DoD installations all around the planet against the stressors of climate change. And so all of this has been going on, and it's just right now it's getting more attention because of the executive order, and then the media is talking about it a bit more now.
And when you talked about the DoD and the work your lab's research is doing to help guide them through this process, that kind of falls in line from a question from Jorge. So we're going to pivot a little bit from the DoD in thinking of this in light of the need of renewing and updating our infrastructure. What type of infrastructure do you think needs to be updated, changed, and even invented to make cities more resilient and adapt to the effect of climate change, specifically the ones that relate to sea level rise and flooding, or like we've seen in the South where I live, compound flooding on our coast? So how does that impact? What research is going on to address these issues?
Right. Well, a lot of it about the flooding, there's a lot of work being done on that. And that's a huge challenge. And one of the many ways is like engineering with nature, coming up with these natural barriers which can help to reduce the vulnerability to rise in sea level or to flooding. When it comes to installations clearly are going to have to work on the, the how they're powered. They're going to have to look at energy efficiencies. They're going to have to look at, more up-to-date HVAC systems and insulation, and just again the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from installations. How are you going to do that? It could start with something as simple as the building materials that are used, or how you build your facilities so that they stay cool in the summer, they stay warm in the winter without using a lot of fossil fuels. So I think a lot of what's going to happen on installations is going to be related to the prevention of flooding or protection from flooding, but it's also going to have to do with your energy source. And there's more and more talk about what to do about extreme weather events. We're having more of these hurricanes, for example, or look what happened in Texas this past winter when you had the cold air that went down into Texas, and they got hit really hard by in this case, it was cold, not hot. And what are we going to do for installations that are perhaps they're in the Southwest and it's already hot and dry there? It could be hotter and drier. So even when it comes to installations involved in military training, you might be losing valuable days of the year when you can't train because it's too hot. So you're going to have to think about that. Maybe in the end, some installations have to be moved. I guess we'll see. I'm more familiar with installations up in places like Alaska and Greenland, where they've been dealing with a thaw and permafrost. It's like how do we keep this air base running when the ground underneath it is thawing out? And so again, installations will be how you provide power for them. And I agree, it's going to have a lot to do with installations that, for example, might be along the seacoast and would be vulnerable to sea level rise. And I can give you an anecdotal story about sea level rise and I will. Do I have time?
Yes,
2 minutes.
You have time.
This is kind of cool. So I told you we pulled this ice core out of Greenland. It's almost a mile long, right? And a couple of years ago, there was a gang over there. I'm looking out my window. I can see Vermont from here. Not a joke. And over in Vermont, at the University of Vermont, they got their hands on a soil sample that came from the bottom of the ice core. So imagine this: you got an ice core going all the way down through this ice sheet in Greenland, a mile long, almost a mile, and at the very bottom, it hit ground. It hit bottom, and there was some sediment, some soil. They were looking at it, and they found if you will, the fossils of plants. So obviously, about 400,000 years ago, there was no ice there. There were plants growing there. And I thought about that, and I thought, wow, that's neat. 400,000 years ago, all that ice wasn't there. I was thinking, that's a lot of ice. And then I realized that if that ice wasn't there, if that ice wasn't there in Greenland, the sea level would rise over 20 feet.
Oh, wow.
So 400,000 years ago, sea level was more than 20 feet higher than today. And that's when there were plants growing on that part of Greenland. So there's a lot of water that's been over hundreds of thousands of years has, slowly been grown and amassed to form that glacier. So that's a lot of water. And we kind of want it to stay as part of the glacial sheet on top of Greenland. We really don't want that to melt. And of course, if that were to melt over upcoming decades, that's where you get the problem with sea level rise with that. And so just something to think about. At the bottom of that 1 mile long ice core were plants. And once upon a time, that 1 mile of ice wasn't sitting on that spot. Where was the
Wow.
water that formed the ice? It was.
Okay, we have one more question from our
Okay.
audience. How has changing climate impacted our military mission of operating on a global scale? So how has the changing climate impacted our military mission of operating on a global scale? So how has this impacted
Right.
force
So
projection?
I got a couple of answers to that. One thing is with the 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 sea ice in the Arctic has been melting, which means the waterways are opening up to the point where it's possible in the upcoming years that there'll be a tremendous amount of shipping across the Arctic by Russia. And so with the opening of the Arctic Ocean, that has really stimulated a lot of interest from Russia and um, and is probably related to the very significant increase in military power projection from Russia. So part of climate change, because of the change in Arctic, um, it 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 has really woken up Russia, if you will, to realize and wow, this is our backyard, and this could be a major sea route, and so because of that, it just enables the movement of potential movement of military forces, right? And so that's one of the things we see in terms of how climate change is affecting military posturing, and so obviously the United States is watching very keenly what's going on up there. And I think when you look at the Army Arctic Strategy, which is entitled uh, uh, Regaining Arctic Dominance, it speaks for itself. So there's an intent for us to be more mindful of the effects of climate change. On the other hand, I want you to consider the following. We're just seeing some of these early signs of climate change. And so when you think about how our military has such a tough mission of national security, they're thinking about now, they're thinking about tomorrow. And a lot of these really devastating effects of climate change might not come for a few more decades. So part of it is the alignment of our national security interests with what we're focusing on today. So it's kind of like we're strategic, yet a lot of what we're doing is tactical. So it's this time element. If you really have to think about the broader picture of climate change and what we need to do today. And I believe that's what Secretary Austin is talking about when he says that the climate change is making the world more unsafe and we need to act. So he wants us to act now to prevent problems in the future. So it's just being proactive now because things could get really messy in the future, again, with some simple concept like sea level rise, where so many tens of millions of people live on coastlines down at sea level. Um, what's going to happen to all those people, or what's going to happen to people who don't have a adequate food supply or potable water supply? So we should act now. Um, and that is like a strategic way of approaching national security. But again, I think maybe part of the wake-up call is the melting of the sea ice in the Arctic. It's clearly that's happening right now, and you can watch what the Russians are doing up there. It's quite a they're really moving out in that area of their national security strategy.
Right. So that's all the questions we have time for right now. For our audience, if you have any additional questions, you can leave them in the LinkedIn chat, or you can email us at erdicinfo@usace.army.mil, and we will get back to you with a response. Dr. Corriveau, this has been such a great discussion, and do you have any closing thoughts and actually, before your closing thoughts, I can't have a conversation with you without asking about our upcoming Innovation Summit. And so if you could tell us a little about Innovation Summit and any other thoughts as we conclude our time with you.
Yeah, I'll close out with that. Thank you. Planning is underway for the next USACE Innovation Summit. It's going to be held virtually. It's going to be held the week of October 25th. We're going to bring in a great lineup of guest speakers, of course, our Command in General and other USACE leaders, but also a lot of wonderful external innovators. For example, what comes to mind is we're bringing in the Chief Innovation Officer for NASA. And so it's going to be a lot of fun. There will be a panel on climate change. And this is going to be a summit for innovation that's all inclusive of the Corps of Engineers, but also the private sector and academia. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I hope to see you all there.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Corriveau. This was a phenomenal discussion. And for our viewers, you can look for us again in the next few weeks as we continue to talk about ERDC's solution to climate change. Thank you so much.